Mm. Hello, Sunshine. Welcome back to another episode of heartablazepodcast. Today, we're going to do a very special episode. It's actually a baking episode, first time on the channel. So, this is very special to me because, and I'll explain why I'm trying to do this video too. A few years back, quite a few years back, actually, it's already been, can't believe how fast time flies. I set out on a journey when I was baking on YouTube, trying to make like a YouTube channel about baking. But I ended up kind of stopping because it just was a little bit too expensive, having no income, but having to constantly kind of take out a lot of money consistently to spend on ingredients to bake and such. And it was also very, very time consuming doing everything on my own. Now, I ended up investing in this grand dream of creating as many unique cheesecake recipes as I can. And I thought, because like it started off with the thought, well, I've never seen anyone make cheesecake with like goat cheese, for example. And that set me on this whole journey of like thinking about all the possibilities. And I ended up coming up with 25 different kind of cheesecakes, all attempting with like different styles of cheesecake, different types of cheese used in a cake, different types of flavor combinations that I haven't seen before, even including some recipes where I basically attempt to make better versions of existing flavors. And yeah, you can catch them all on an ebook. You can purchase the ebook, I should say, on Kindle, Amazon. It's called Pretty Great Cheesecakes, should I mention that? And you'll get 25 cheesecakes, but that's not the only thing that was special about this cake. There was another thing I tried to tackle with this book, which I think is very, very amazing, is that for me, I'm a very visual learner. And what I set out to attempt to do was improve ebooks or recipe books in general. And the way I was doing it was I basically made sure I took, and this is why it took so long, I took very, very detailed step-by-step photos on top of very detailed written descriptions of the method. And then on top of that, there was one thing that bugs me about recipes is I always have to keep going up and down. Like you either had to like weigh out all the ingredients or you have to keep checking the ingredients. And I just thought, honestly, wouldn't it be so much easier if we had the ingredients so you can weigh stuff out, but also had the ingredients listed again throughout the sentences in the methods. That way you can always double check and make sure nothing goes wrong. And it's just more convenient too. I don't know, I just thought that was a really cool little feature. And the reason why it's so detailed is I really wanted a book to make it really special for not only people who love baking or already have been baking for a long time, try to make it more accessible to novice bakers and people. Like I have friends who have always talked about wanting to get into the kitchen more and kind of get to learn how to cook and bake. And, it just puts them off sometimes because they're worried that they can't do it properly, or that they're not like smart enough or something crazy like that. But really, you just need the right guidance. And I think a lot of things with recipes or like teachers teaching baking is sometimes they just kind of get, I don't know if it's because they feel a little bit cockier or they've forgotten like when it is when they were like younger and still a novice or a beginner. It's all about dumbing things down. And it sounds bad, but it's true. Dumbing things down in a way for people to understand. And the most important thing is always pair actions with reason. Knowing why you do something always makes it easier, for me personally at least, to remember. And I've seen that in a lot of people when I was training them when I worked in a cafe. For many, many years, it always worked perfectly for people. It was always dependent on, kind of like when you use Google, like sometimes you get great results when you find out how to word things specifically in a way that makes it more efficient for the search engine to function. It's the same concept. Anyway, so in this book, I have a recipe that I decided to start it off on because for the videos is because it's kind of simple ingredients, so it's more affordable, and two, it's also just like a very easy cheesecake concept to grasp. The overall method is relatively simple, and yeah, and it's just a really, really tasty cheesecake, but very, very special too, because I haven't really seen this before, like anywhere else. Anyway, so the reason for this video is because I needed to promote the book more, because not a lot of people know about it and it's just not selling. And I thought maybe one of the ways to create an incentive is if I cut it into separate and start selling them as separate recipes. And this video just shows you kind of what the cake process is like and what it looks like finished, and give you a little bit of a glimpse into the recipe making. I won't give it ingredients, unfortunately, because it's supposed to be an incentive for making for buying the book or the recipe cards. But yeah, so it'll be linked down below. And I understand that sometimes frustrates people, but it's only going to be $10 for the recipe card. And I think the book is only around $24 or something. It's very, very cheap for a 25 cheesecake book. And it's an ebook because there's just too many details, that there's way too many pages to make it affordable printing it into physical copies. But anyway, that's my spiel. Enjoy the recipe video, and yeah, talk to you soon. So we're going to start off by prepping the pan. I'm using about an 8-inch circle pan here, and I believe that's around probably like 20 centimeters. So you want to take a square sheet of baking paper and basically fold it into a triangle, into a square, into a triangle, and then keep folding it into a triangle until you have like a very thin kind of, think of like a waffle shape essentially, but with all the opening on one side. And then once you get to a thin enough triangle, basically match it to the size of the pan on the bottom. That way you know from the diameter out how much you need to cover the bottom space, and then cut it with the scissors, and then basically line the bottom. And this is just to make sure that cakes are removed much easier to remove. And we also want to cover the sides, but with the sides, because the pan's quite shallow and most of the cakes are quite tall, we're going to basically make like an extension. So I do, as you can see, basically 2 layers of it, so that because it's quite flimsy, the baking paper, you can also staple it on the top. That's what I used to do for the book. Here I'm just skipping that step because I know it'll work, because I had to do that like several times for 25 cheesecakes. But just make sure when you're overlapping, make sure like the open ends for each one is basically opposite. That way it really stabilizes it. Now set that aside, and we're going to jump on to working on the next steps. Usually over here, the book will really give you a detailed explanation on how to use foil to cover the outside, because we're going to be water bathing this cheesecake. It's basically what it does is kind of cooks the cake more consistently and more gently, so it creates like really uniform texture, almost like a very sort of like smooth, silky kind of texture. I've actually just realized last minute that I was missing aluminium foil altogether. So one of the cheats that I used to do, which doesn't always work, it does still kind of leak into it a little bit, but it's good enough that it won't affect the texture too much, is use baking paper and a little bit of string to tie it. What I did there was basically use tooth floss. And over here, we're going to start melting some butter in the pan, unsalted butter that is, and we're basically making a roux as the base of the cheesecake. So what you're doing is we're going to start melting the butter until it's completely just dissolved, but not too hot. And then we're going to add in a mixture of flour and corn flour and a bit of salt, and make sure to sieve that first. And we're going to sieve that straight into the pan, and then we're going to whisk it together and make sure it's nicely combined. It's going to come across a little dry or like a little bit crumbly, looks like sort of like little crumbles, and that's totally fine. Just make sure there's no pockets of like actual powdered like flour or dry ingredients, and everything is nicely coated, then it's all good. Next, we're going to work on the cheesecake base, the cheese mixture. So in a bowl over some simmering water, make sure it's not too hot, just a little bit of simmering water with a tiny bit of bubbling. Put a heat-proof bowl over it and basically melt down the cheese with the milk and the lime zest. And then make sure it's nice and smoothly mixed together. I'm not whisking it here, I'm just stirring. But the reason I'm using a whisk is because a whisk just does a better job at breaking things down, especially when it's kind of clumpy things like cheese. And the next part, you basically just want to take the roux mixture and again using the whisk to help break it up and stir it until it's nice and smoothly combined with the cheese mixture. Next, I basically separate 6 eggs, egg whites in a bowl that is nice and clean, preferably stainless steel, and make sure it's completely void of fat and the yolks. And the yolks just go straight into the cheese mixture. Then for the cheese mixture with the yolks now added, we're also going to add some caster sugar, and then we're going to give that a nice little whisk and stir, and basically make sure everything is well combined with no traces of egg yolk. So if you don't know, this is basically a souffle style cheesecake, and it basically involves creating basically a base cheese mixture and then folding stiff meringue into it, which is basically what aerates and provides that amazing texture. So over here, I'm coming back to the egg whites, and basically you want to start by whisking it, ideally on a stand mixer with a whisk attachment on sort of a medium low, but on the lower end kind of setting. You want it enough to kind of start aerating it pretty quickly, but also you'd also want it to be building the texture very, very finely, so you see a lot of fine foams. You can see here I kind of can't find the attachment, and also couldn't find my hand beater either, so I had to use this more like for beverage kind of beater, and you can see there's a lot of big bubbles forming, so I can already tell like that the cheesecake's texture isn't going to be as amazing compared to the Brooks one, just because from experience I know what it requires to construct that kind of cheesecake. So ideally, if you can, definitely invest in a stand mixer. Hand beaters are definitely the best next. And again, use a slightly lower setting to build the texture. And what we're looking for is we're trying to build the texture up until it is able to be thick enough that you can spoon a small spoonful of the meringue and it sits on itself nicely and doesn't disappear. From that point on, we add the sugar, and then we basically whisk and keep whisking until it gets to stiff peaks. That is when you pull up the whisk and it leaves like a sort of a little bird's beak shape. And you don't want to overmix it either and make it too dry. If the meringue looks a bit dry, that means you definitely overmixed it, and that tends to kind of form a lot of clumpy lumps very quickly, and you'll find it's a lot harder to whisk into things and also, or fold into things I should say. And it definitely will create a lesser good cake because it then kind of tend to overmix it. Anyway, so I got to the stiff peaks. Now I'm bringing back the base mixture here, and then we're going to basically fold it in with 3 parts. The first third is basically to allow the mixture to become lighter, so it's kind of like a sacrificial portion. Essentially lining up the mixture so it better combines with the other parts of the meringue, which is then the purpose there for the purpose of aeration. So you can see I prefer using a whisk to fold. I've always found that to be a lot more efficient than a spatula and always created better products. You just have to learn the right technique. The idea is to obviously not use the whisk as a beating motion and use it in the same motion you would use a spatula to fold. So that is to go to the bottom and bring it back up and let it gently fall, scoop to the bottom and let it gently fall, and do it in different motions of figure 8 and go around different directions of the bowl to make sure every single section is covered. You just kind of want to work on any white streaks that you see and focus on those parts so you don't do unnecessary folding that deflates the air out of the mixture. Because remember, the fluffier your texture of your batter is, the better your cake's going to be. You can see how much volume it has grown. It's really, really cool. And here is the final third part of the portion of meringue. And again, gently folding that in. And usually what I tend to do, because whisk can actually obviously do that, I do switch back to a spatula for a few final folds. but as few as I can limit it to. And you want to really focus on the bottom of the bowl, because I find that's where a lot of the base cheese mixture tends to catch down there, and it needs to be folded in properly. If you don't, those parts will definitely create a denser layer in your cake, and it won't be as pretty, and definitely will affect the texture, because then you're going to get this super fluffy cake with like little bits of like dense, more custardy, but kind of, yeah, dense bits of cake there, and you don't want that. And then we pour it into the pan gently. You don't want to be too aggressive with this part, throwing it in there, because that would knock out all the lovely air that you incorporated. And then we basically need to prepare a pan and lots of hot water, boiling water ideally. Set the cake in there, and then top up the pan, not the cake one, but the square pan, with hot water, and up about halfway of the volume of the cake batter. And then we're going to bake this for 1 hour and 20 minutes. And this is a step that I actually kind of screwed up. I was in a rush to make this and haven't made this cake in a long time, didn't read the last part correctly. It's very important to leave the cake baked in the oven after the oven switched off for 30 to 45 minutes. It's such a rookie mistake. But the reason for that is because these cakes are very, very delicate, especially when water bathed. So generally for any water bath cake, I suggest this. It's to prevent a temperature shock. If you find it kind of shrinks inwards a little bit, unlike the picture, which is super beautiful and stable and like basically a perfect cake, that's because you've gone from hot to very cold room temperature very quickly, and the cake doesn't like that. So make sure you do that. So you can find my cake definitely did crack, because I think I didn't actually add enough water. And also, I think like the meringue is obviously a little bit less consistent as the way I like it in terms of texture. It's not fine bubbles, it's more like inconsistent bubbles due to the way that I've had to mix it with a beverage mixer. Serving wise, I recommend definitely cooling it to room temperature, then putting it in the fridge and let it sit overnight, develops the flavor, lets the texture settle. It's overall more enjoyable. Anyway, I hope that gives you incentive to buy the book. Enjoy.